There comes a moment in every person's journey when they feel the full weight of existence pressing down upon their shoulders, when responsibilities multiply, when burdens accumulate, when pressure intensifies until each breath becomes an act of defiance against forces that would crush the unprepared. In this moment, you discover something fundamental about yourself, something raw and revealing that cannot be hidden behind comfortable illusions or convenient excuses. You discover whether you're built to carry weight or destined to be crushed by it. Look around, truly look. What do you see? Legions of the broken, armies of the crushed, masses who encountered the inevitable weight of existence and found themselves unprepared for its relentless pressure. They walk among us, these broken ones. You see them everywhere. Their spirits visibly bent beneath burdens they were never equipped to carry. Their eyes reveal the truth. Something essential collapsed within them when the pressure intensified beyond what they believed they could bear. But then there are the others, the rare few, the ones who carry crushing weight yet remain unbowed, who shoulder burdens that would break most spirits yet continue forward with steady step and unwavering gaze, who bear responsibilities that would shatter ordinary resolve yet somehow transform this pressure into fuel rather than allowing it to become fatal. These are the Atlas figures of our world, named for the Titan of ancient myth who carried the heavens upon his shoulders. They possess something the broken ones never developed, the capacity to bear immense weight without being destroyed by it. This capacity isn't mystical, isn't supernatural, isn't some rare genetic gift bestowed upon a fortunate few while denied to everyone else. It's a mindset, a framework, an approach to existence that transforms how weight is experienced, understood, and carried. The Atlas mindset. It begins with a fundamental shift in perception, a complete reframing of what weight represents in human existence. Most view responsibility as burden, see pressure as punishment, experience weight as curse to be avoided rather than capacity to be developed. The Atlas views these differently, not through naive positive thinking or comfortable self-deception, but through clear-eyed recognition of an essential truth most never grasp. The capacity to carry weight isn't just necessary for survival, it's the foundation of all meaningful human existence. Think about it. Everything of value requires carrying weight that would be easier to put down. Everything meaningful demands bearing pressure that would be simpler to avoid. Everything worth building necessitates shouldering responsibility that would be more comfortable to reject. Family, community, purpose, legacy, creation, protection, growth, mastery. None of these exist without the willingness and ability to carry significant weight. None materialize without the capacity to bear substantial pressure. None emerge without the strength to shoulder serious responsibility. The broken ones never fully understood this connection, never recognized that their instinctive avoidance of weight didn't lead to freedom but to emptiness, that their reflexive rejection of pressure didn't create liberation but limitation, that their habitual evasion of responsibility didn't produce independence but insignificance. The Atlas grasps what they missed. Weight isn't the enemy of a fulfilling existence, it's the necessary foundation. Pressure isn't the obstacle to meaningful contribution. It's the essential precondition. Responsibility isn't the barrier to personal freedom, it's the required pathway. Because here's the truth, most will never acknowledge. Nothing of value is created without weight being carried. Nothing significant is built without pressure being endured. Nothing meaningful is accomplished without responsibility being shouldered. This recognition transforms everything that follows, alters the entire relationship with the inevitable weight that arrives throughout human existence. Instead of asking, "How can I avoid this weight?" the Atlas asks, "How can I develop the capacity to carry it effectively?" Instead of thinking, "Why must I endure this pressure?" the Atlas thinks, "How can I harness this pressure as fuel rather than allowing it to become crushing?" Instead of lamenting, "This responsibility limits my freedom," the Atlas understands, "This responsibility creates the only form of freedom that matters. The freedom to build something significant through my chosen burdens, rather than being defined by my avoided challenges." This shift isn't semantic trickery, not linguistic sleight of hand, not conceptual manipulation divorced from practical reality. It's the essential reframing that makes all effective weight-bearing possible. The cognitive foundation that enables the physical, emotional, and spiritual capacity to carry what would break those lacking this fundamental understanding. With this foundation established, the Atlas mindset advances to its second critical element: strategic assessment. The broken ones typically fail in one of two ways when encountering significant weight. Either they reflexively reject burdens they could have carried with proper approach, or they mindlessly accept responsibilities they aren't yet equipped to shoulder effectively. Both paths lead to collapse. Both choices end in breakage. Both decisions result in the crushing of spirit essential for sustained weight-bearing capacity. The Atlas chooses differently, approaches weight not with impulsive reaction but with strategic assessment, not with emotional response but with calculated evaluation. This assessment focuses on three essential questions. Is this weight mine to carry? Does this responsibility naturally belong on my shoulders? Or am I attempting to shoulder burdens that properly belong to others? Am I accepting appropriate weight or engaging in rescue fantasies, martyrdom complexes, or ego-driven demonstrations of capacity that serve neither myself nor those I aim to support? Is this weight carryable in its current form? Can this burden be shouldered as currently structured, or must it be redistributed, reimagined, or reorganized before it can be effectively borne? Am I facing a weight that requires modification before carrying, or am I dealing with a responsibility that can be shouldered in its present configuration? Am I properly equipped to carry this weight? Have I developed the necessary physical capacity, mental frameworks, emotional resilience, and spiritual depth required for this specific burden? Or am I attempting to carry weight I'm not yet prepared to shoulder effectively? These questions aren't abstract philosophy. They're practical assessments essential for sustainable weight-bearing. They're strategic evaluations necessary for carrying burdens that would crush those who approach weight without such calculated consideration. The broken ones rarely ask these questions. They simply react, either grabbing burdens beyond their capacity or fleeing responsibilities within their potential range. They operate from impulse rather than strategy, from emotion rather than calculation, from reaction rather than assessment. And in this reactive approach, they ensure eventual collapse, guarantee ultimate breaking, secure the final crushing of spirit that makes sustained weight-bearing impossible. The Atlas takes a different path, approaches each burden with these questions firmly in mind. evaluates each responsibility through this strategic framework, assesses each weight with these calculations consciously applied, not to avoid necessary burdens, but to ensure effective carrying of appropriate weight, not to evade meaningful responsibility, but to guarantee sustainable shouldering of significant pressure, not to escape consequential challenges, but to secure productive engagement with substantive demands. With these assessments completed, the Atlas mindset advances to its third essential element, structural preparation. Most approach weight-bearing with exclusive focus on strength, on raw power, on the muscular capacity to lift what most cannot lift, to carry what most cannot carry, to endure what most cannot endure. This approach inevitably leads to collapse, to breakdown, to the crushing of body and spirit that makes continued weight-bearing impossible. Because strength alone never suffices for sustained carrying of significant weight, power by itself never enables extended bearing of substantial burden. Muscular capacity in isolation never permits enduring shouldering of consequential responsibility. The Atlas understands what others miss. Effective weight-bearing isn't just about strength, it's about structure. Not just about power, but about positioning. Not just about muscular capacity, but about mechanical advantage. This understanding transforms how preparation occurs, shifts the focus from merely building stronger muscles to creating more effective structural support, from developing greater raw power to establishing superior mechanical positioning, from increasing isolated capacity to enhancing integrated systems. This structural preparation encompasses 5 essential domains. Physical structure, the bodily foundation that makes all other weight-bearing possible. The musculoskeletal system that must be developed, not just for strength, but for alignment. Not just for power, but for endurance. Not just for capacity, but for sustainability. The Atlas approaches physical preparation differently than most. Doesn't train merely for appearance or performance, but for functional capacity to bear significant weight over extended periods. Doesn't develop just mirror muscles that show well, but structural systems that support effectively. Doesn't build only peak strength, but sustainable endurance. This preparation isn't vanity disguised as necessity. It's recognition that all other weight-bearing capacities rest upon physical foundation, that mental frameworks collapse without bodily support, that emotional resilience crumbles without physical endurance, that spiritual depth disintegrates without material vessel capable of containing it during prolonged pressure. Mental structure, the cognitive frameworks that determine how weight is perceived, processed, and carried. The thought patterns that either support effective burden bearing or guarantee eventual collapse under pressure. The Atlas develops mental structures specifically designed for sustained weight-bearing, frameworks that transform how pressure is experienced, thought patterns that alter how responsibility is processed, cognitive approaches that change how burden impacts consciousness. These structures include perspective frameworks that place current weight in larger context, reducing its perceived crushing capacity. Meaningful narratives that connect present burden to purpose larger than momentary experience, creating sustainable motivation for continued carrying. Cognitive techniques that transform how pressure registers in consciousness, converting what crushes others into what strengthens the properly prepared. This mental preparation isn't self-deception, isn't denial of reality, isn't fantasy disguised as framework. It's strategic reorganization of how reality is processed. intentional restructuring of how experience registers in consciousness, deliberate reformation of how weight impacts awareness during extended carrying of significant burden, emotional structure, the affective systems that either support or sabotage effective weight bearing, the feeling patterns that either enhance or undermine capacity to carry significant responsibility over time. The Atlas develops emotional structures specifically engineered for sustained burden bearing, systems that process feeling without becoming dominated by it, approaches that acknowledge emotion without surrendering to it, frameworks that incorporate affective experience without being controlled by it. These structures include emotional processing techniques that prevent accumulation of unaddressed feeling during extended pressure, effective release mechanisms that discharge emotional intensity without compromising ongoing responsibility, feeling integration approaches that harness emotional energy as fuel rather than allowing it to become destabilizing force. This emotional preparation isn't suppression disguised as strength, isn't denial masked as discipline, isn't avoidance pretending to be power. It's sophisticated engagement with feeling that prevents emotional overwhelming during extended weight bearing, strategic processing that ensures effective experience enhances rather than undermines capacity to carry significant responsibility, systematic integration that transforms emotion from potential liability into actual asset during sustained pressure. Social structure, the relational systems that either multiply or divide weight bearing capacity, the interpersonal frameworks that either enhance or erode ability to carry significant burden over time. The Atlas develops social structures specifically designed for sustained responsibility carrying, systems that distribute weight without diminishing accountability, approaches that share burden without surrendering ownership, frameworks that create support without enabling dependency. These structures include strategic alliances with others who understand effective weight bearing, intentional partnerships that multiply capacity through shared commitment to responsibility, purposeful communities that enhance individual ability through collective engagement with meaningful challenge. This social preparation isn't abdication disguised as collaboration, isn't escape masked as partnership, isn't avoidance pretending to be community. It's sophisticated engagement with others that recognizes how properly structured relationships enhance rather than diminish individual capacity. Strategic connection that ensures social bonds strengthen rather than weaken ability to bear significant weight. Systematic integration of others into weight-bearing systems without surrendering personal responsibility for essential burdens. Spiritual structure, the meaning frameworks that either sustain or sabotage weight-bearing capacity during extended pressure. The purpose systems that either enhance or erode ability to carry significant responsibility over time. The Atlas develops spiritual structures specifically engineered for sustained burden bearing, systems that connect current weight to transcendent purpose, creating renewable motivation for continued carrying. Approaches that link present pressure to meaning beyond momentary experience, establishing sustainable energy for ongoing responsibility. Frameworks that position current challenge within larger narrative, generating enduring commitment to chosen burdens. These structures include purpose frameworks that answer why the weight is worth carrying when the how becomes temporarily unclear. Meaning systems that provide renewable energy when physical, mental, and emotional resources face temporary depletion. Transcendent connections that create sustainability, impossible to generate through material motivation alone. This spiritual preparation isn't delusion disguised as depth, isn't fantasy masked as faith, isn't escapism pretending to be enlightenment. It's sophisticated engagement with meaning that recognizes how properly structured purpose enhances, rather than diminishes weight-bearing capacity. Strategic connection to something larger than momentary experience that ensures transcendent motivation, strengthens rather than weakens ability to bear significant burden. Systematic integration of spiritual framework without surrendering rational engagement with practical reality. Together, these 5 structural preparations transform what's possible in weight-bearing capacity. Convert what would crush the unprepared into what strengthens the properly structured. Change what would break ordinary resolve into what builds extraordinary capability in those who approach weight with strategic understanding rather than reactive emotion. With these structures established, the Atlas mindset advances to its 4th essential element, rhythmic sustainability. The broken ones typically approach weight-bearing as singular event, as isolated challenge, as discrete episode with clear beginning and definitive end. They summon all resources for momentary demonstration of capacity, gather all strength for temporary display of power, collect all energy for transient exhibition of ability. Then they break, collapse, crumble under pressure. They approached as sprint rather than ultramarathon, as short burst rather than extended journey, as momentary challenge rather than perpetual reality. The Atlas understands what they missed. Significant weight-bearing isn't event but process, not isolated challenge but ongoing reality. Not discrete episode but continuous journey that demands sustainable approach rather than momentary mobilization. This understanding transforms how weight is carried, shifts focus from maximum short-term capacity to optimal long-term sustainability, from peak performance to perpetual effectiveness, from isolated demonstration to extended implementation. The Atlas approaches weight-bearing as rhythmic rather than static process, as oscillating rather than constant reality, as flowing rather than fixed experience that requires systematic alternation between distinct modes of carrying, rather than perpetual maintenance of singular approach. This rhythmic sustainability encompasses 5 essential oscillations: between intensity and recovery, the strategic alternation between periods of maximum output and deliberate restoration, between phases of full capacity engagement and intentional renewal, between cycles of complete commitment and purposeful regeneration. The Atlas never attempts perpetual intensity, recognizes such approach, guarantees eventual collapse through depletion of finite resources, understands sustainable weight-bearing requires rhythmic movement between giving everything and strategically renewing what's been depleted. This oscillation isn't weakness disguised as strategy, isn't laziness masked as sustainability, isn't avoidance pretending to be wisdom. It's sophisticated energy management that recognizes how properly structured rhythms enhance rather than diminish weight-bearing capacity. Strategic alternation that ensures physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual resources remain renewable rather than becoming permanently depleted. Systematic variation between distinct carrying modes that transforms what would quickly exhaust the unprepared into what progressively strengthens the properly oscillating. Between engagement and perspective, the regular alternation between full immersion in present weight and strategic withdrawal to broader context. Between complete absorption in current burden and intentional connection to larger framework. Between total presence with immediate responsibility and purposeful linkage to transcendent meaning. The Atlas never remains perpetually immersed without perspective shift. Recognizes such approach guarantees eventual collapse through loss of meaningful context. Understand sustainable weight-bearing requires rhythmic movement between carrying with full presence and stepping back to recognize larger purpose behind current pressure. This oscillation isn't dissociation disguised as perspective, isn't escape masked as context, isn't avoidance pretending to be insight. It's sophisticated attention management that recognizes how properly structured perspective shifts enhance rather than diminish weight-bearing capacity. Strategic alternation that ensures immediate pressure remains connected to larger purpose rather than becoming disconnected from meaningful context. Systematic variation between immersion and perspective that transforms what would quickly become meaningless to the unfocused into what progressively reveals deeper significance to the properly oscillating. Between social connection and solitary carrying, the intentional alternation between shared burden bearing and individual responsibility. Between collective engagement and personal ownership. Between communal support and solitary strength. The Atlas never attempts complete isolation or total dependency. Recognizes both approaches guarantee eventual collapse through either overwhelming pressure or atrophied capacity. Understand sustainable weight-bearing requires rhythmic movement between carrying with others and carrying alone, between sharing weight and owning weight, between connected responsibility and individual accountability. This oscillation isn't inconsistency disguised as strategy, isn't relationship dysfunction masked as approach, isn't attachment disorder pretending to be methodology. It's sophisticated relationship management that recognizes how properly structured social rhythms enhance rather than diminish weight-bearing capacity. Strategic alternation that ensures neither isolation nor dependency dominates weight-bearing approach. Systematic variation between connection and solitude that transforms what would quickly become either crushing or enabling into progressive strengthening of both individual and collective capacity. Between structured routine and adaptive responsiveness, the purposeful alternation between established patterns and flexible adjustment, between disciplined consistency and creative adaptation, between reliable systems and innovative solutions. The Atlas never becomes either rigidly fixed and unchanging approach or chaotically responsive without stable foundation. Recognizes both extremes guarantee eventual collapse through either brittleness or instability. Understands sustainable weight-bearing requires rhythmic movement between trusted methods that provide reliable foundation and adaptive adjustments that address changing circumstances. This oscillation isn't indecisiveness disguised as flexibility, isn't lack of commitment masked as adaptability, isn't avoidance pretending to be innovation. It's sophisticated approach management that recognizes how properly structured methodological rhythms enhance rather than diminish weight-bearing capacity. Strategic alternation that ensures neither rigid adherence to outdated methods nor constant reinvention of functional systems dominates weight-bearing approach. Systematic variation between trusted fundamentals and necessary innovation that transforms what would quickly become either obsolete or unstable into progressively more effective carrying capacity. Between conscious attention and automatic execution, the strategic alternation between full awareness of weight-bearing process and subconscious implementation of established patterns, between complete presence with carrying methodology and background execution of developed systems, between deliberate focus on burden-bearing approach and automatic application of internalized frameworks, the Atlas never remains in perpetual conscious processing of weight-bearing mechanics. Recognizes such approach guarantees eventual collapse through cognitive overload and attention depletion. Understands sustainable weight-bearing requires rhythmic movement between periods of full attention to carrying process and phases where established patterns execute automatically without constant conscious supervision. This oscillation isn't mindlessness disguised as efficiency, isn't unconsciousness masked as development, isn't dissociation pretending to be mastery. It's sophisticated attention management that recognizes how properly structured cognitive rhythms enhance, rather than diminish, weight-bearing capacity. Strategic alternation that ensures neither constant conscious processing nor completely automatic execution dominates weight-bearing approach. Systematic variation between full attention and background implementation that transforms what would quickly exhaust cognitive resources into sustainable carrying capacity, supported by both conscious direction and automatic execution. Together, these 5 oscillations create the rhythmic sustainability that makes extended weight-bearing possible. That transforms what would quickly deplete the unsustainable into what progressively strengthens the properly rhythmic. That converts what would rapidly exhaust the unprepared into what continually develops the strategically oscillating. With these rhythms established, the Atlas mindset reaches its final essential element, progressive capacity expansion. The broken ones typically approach weight-bearing as fixed reality, as static capacity, as unchangeable limitation that either allows carrying of specific burden or guarantees collapse under particular pressure. The Atlas understands what they missed. Weight-bearing capacity isn't fixed but expandable, not static but dynamic, not predetermined limitation but progressively developable capability that grows through strategic engagement with incrementally increasing burden. This understanding transforms the entire relationship with weight, shifts perspective from avoiding what exceeds current capacity to strategically engaging with what expands existing capability. From escaping what feels overwhelming to systematically approaching what develops enlarged carrying potential. From evading what seems impossible to progressively building capacity for what initially appears beyond possible range. The Atlas approaches weight not just as current burden, but as developmental opportunity, not merely as present responsibility, but as capacity expanding possibility. Not simply as immediate pressure, but as strength increasing potential. This progressive capacity expansion follows 3 essential principles: incremental progression rather than quantum leaping, the strategic approach of adding weight in manageable increments rather than massive increases, of expanding burden in sustainable steps rather than overwhelming jumps, of increasing responsibility in digestible additions rather than crushing amplifications. The Atlas never attempts weight jumps that guarantee collapse, recognizes such approach destroys both current capacity and future development. Understand sustainable expansion requires progressive loading that challenges without crushing, that stretches without breaking, that develops without destroying. This incremental progression isn't timidity disguised as strategy, isn't fear masked as approach, isn't avoidance pretending to be methodology. It's sophisticated development protocol that recognizes how properly structured progression enhances, rather than diminishes, expanding capacity. Strategic increment that ensures challenge creates growth rather than collapse. Systematic advancement that transforms what would quickly destroy the unprepared into what progressively strengthens the properly developing. Targeted development rather than generalized loading. The purposeful approach of specifically strengthening identified limitations rather than indiscriminately increasing overall burden. Of strategically addressing recognized constraints rather than blindly amplifying total weight. Of systematically expanding particular capacities rather than randomly multiplying general responsibility. The Atlas never attempts undifferentiated increase without targeted development. Recognizes such approach guarantees collapse at weakest point, regardless of strength elsewhere in system. Understands sustainable expansion requires specific strengthening of identified limitations before general increase of overall burden. This targeted development isn't obsession disguised as strategy, isn't perfectionism masked as approach, isn't avoidance pretending to be methodology. It's sophisticated constraint management that recognizes how properly structured targeting enhances, rather than diminishes expanding capacity. Strategic focus that ensures specific limitations receive development priority before general increase creates system failure. Systematic attention to particular constraints that transforms what would quickly break at weakest point into progressively more balanced carrying capacity. Cyclical loading rather than linear progression. The strategic approach of alternating between periods of increased burden and phases of relative deloading, of oscillating between cycles of expanded responsibility and intervals of comparative recovery, of varying between episodes of amplified pressure and stages of proportional restoration. The Atlas never attempts perpetually linear increase without cyclical variation. Recognizes such approach guarantees eventual collapse through accumulated stress without adequate adaptation opportunity. Understands sustainable expansion requires rhythmic alternation between loading phases that stimulate growth and deloading intervals that permit adaptation. This cyclical loading isn't inconsistency disguised as strategy, isn't indecisiveness masked as approach, isn't avoidance pretending to be methodology. It's sophisticated stress management that recognizes how properly structured cycles enhance rather than diminish expanding capacity. Strategic oscillation that ensures stress creates adaptation rather than breakdown. Systematic variation between challenge and recovery that transforms what would quickly accumulate into crushing pressure into progressively developing carrying capacity. Together, these three principles create the progressive capacity expansion that transforms what initially appears unbearable into what eventually becomes manageable. That converts what originally seems crushing into what ultimately becomes strengthening. That changes what first appears impossible into what finally becomes accomplished reality. This, then, is the Atlas mindset in its entirety. The comprehensive approach to weight, bearing that transforms how burden is experienced, carried, and ultimately utilized for development rather than destruction. It begins with fundamental reframing that recognizes weight as necessary foundation for meaningful existence, rather than obstacle to be avoided whenever possible. It advances through strategic assessment that determines which weights belong on your shoulders, which require modification before carrying, and which demand further preparation before effective shouldering becomes possible. It develops through structural preparation across physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual domains, creating integrated system capable of bearing significant weight without collapsing under pressure that would crush less comprehensive approaches. It sustains through rhythmic oscillation between complementary carrying modes, establishing sustainability impossible to achieve through static methodology or rigid approach. It expands through progressive capacity development, transforming initial limitations into continually increasing capability through strategic engagement with incrementally challenging burden. Together, these elements create weight-bearing capacity beyond what most believe possible, beyond what conventional thinking considers reasonable, beyond what ordinary approaches could ever develop or sustain. They create the Atlas capacity, the ability to shoulder burdens that would break most spirits, to carry responsibilities that would crush most resolves, to bear weights that would collapse most approaches. Not through superhuman genetic gifts or mystical unseen powers, but through strategic mindset development that transforms how weight is perceived, experienced, and ultimately carried. This capacity doesn't emerge overnight, doesn't develop through casual engagement, doesn't materialize without dedicated implementation of each essential element. It requires commitment, demands consistency, necessitates strategic rather than reactive engagement with the inevitable weight that arrives in every consequential human journey. But for those willing to develop this mindset, to implement this approach, to embrace this framework, something remarkable awaits. The capacity to carry what would break others, to shoulder what would crush most, to bear what would collapse many, not just without breaking, but while continuing to grow, not merely without crushing, but while progressively strengthening, not simply without collapsing, but while systematically expanding. This is the Atlas gift, the capacity to carry the heavens without being destroyed by their weight, to shoulder immense burden without being crushed by its pressure, to bear significant responsibility without being broken by its demand. A gift available not through genetic fortune or mystical blessing, but through strategic development of the mindset that transforms how weight is carried, experienced, and ultimately utilized for growth rather than destruction. The only question remaining is whether you'll develop this mindset, whether you'll implement this approach, whether you'll embrace this framework that transforms what would break ordinary resolve into what builds extraordinary capacity. The weight already exists. The burden already awaits. The responsibility already approaches. Will you meet it with the Atlas mindset, or will you face it with a conventional approach that eventually breaks beneath pressure it was never designed to carry? The choice is yours. The consequences will be too.